Echo of Regret. Part 4. The Echo of Regret. Part 4. Description. Vanessa's conquest was flawless for exactly 1 month. 5 nations, 5 puppet rulers, 1 queen pulling every string from the shadows. And then the cracks began to show. A dictator drunk on his first taste of power. A country printed into ruin. A kingdom that buried every ruler she sent it. A crown she could never touch. And a woman so convinced of her own invincibility that she forgot the oldest rule of empire. The throne is only as strong as the loyalty beneath it. As Vanessa's iron fist tightens into something crueler, more careless, and more paranoid, the very people she built her kingdom on begin to whisper in the dark. What comes up must come down. And Vanessa Hitch, the woman who took 2 lives and a piece of the world with them, is about to learn that no empire built on blood ever stands for long. The Echo of Regret. Part 4. For 31 days, Vanessa Hitch believed she had done what no one in the history of the world had ever done. She had taken 5 nations without a single declared war, without a single flag raised in her name, without the world even understanding, at first, what had happened to it. 5 leaders gone, 5 replacements installed, a decade of patience distilled into one perfect, invisible Christmas morning, and on the other side of it, a woman who owned the world and had simply forgotten to tell it. She stood in her command center, a converted floor of a skyscraper she'd bought under 6 shell companies, its windows blacked out, its walls lined with screens that fed her real-time intelligence from every continent. And she felt, for the first time since she was 12 years old and standing over her mother's body, complete. It didn't last. The first sign of trouble came out of China, and it came fast. Arthur Finch, the disgraced judge she'd pulled out of gambling debt and installed as the country's new dictator, had never wanted power for the sake of governing. He'd wanted it for the sake of never being powerless again. Within a week of his installation, that hunger curdled into something uglier. He began ordering public executions, not of dissidents, not of threats, but of anyone whose face he didn't like, anyone who hesitated a half-second too long before bowing. He had cameras installed in the town squares so the killings could be broadcast, believing, in his small and desperate mind, that fear was the same thing as loyalty. Vanessa watched the footage from her command center with her jaw tight. This wasn't control. This was chaos wearing a crown. Finch had confused cruelty for command, and now the streets that should have been quiet with obedience were instead simmering with a silence that felt less like submission and more like the pause before a scream. She picked up the encrypted line herself. "You were a judge, Arthur. You understand the law is a leash, not a whip. Every body you leave in that square is a recruitment poster for whoever decides to come for you next." "They fear me," Finch said, and there was a tremor in his voice that told her he'd started drinking again. "Fear isn't loyalty," she said, and hung up, already knowing it was too late to unteach him. Russia was worse, in its own slower, grayer way. Eleanor Vance, the prosecutor whose idealism Vanessa had once so carefully cultivated, had no idea how to run a treasury. She understood indictments, not interest rates. Within weeks, she had ordered the central bank to print money to cover the gaps in a budget she didn't understand, and the ruble began its collapse the way a body collapses after the heart stops, slowly, and then all at once. Store shelves emptied. Savings evaporated overnight. What had been a nuclear power with a functioning, if flawed, economy became, in the space of a season, a country of lines and hunger and the particular kind of quiet rage that comes from watching your children go without. Vanessa had wanted control of the world's currencies. Instead, in Russia, she had produced a currency worth less than the paper it was printed on, and a population that no longer had anything left to lose. In America, at least, there was discipline, the wrong kind. Her 5 military recruits, granted joint command as a council, had approached governance the only way they knew how, as a theater of war. Curfews at 5 o'clock, armed patrols on residential streets, checkpoints on highways that had once carried commuters and now carried soldiers checking papers like the country was an occupied territory instead of a homeland. It worked in the narrowest sense. The streets were controlled, but control and consent are not the same animal, and Vanessa began receiving reports of resistance cells forming in cities that hadn't seen organized unrest in a generation. The Saudi throne she had already lost in every way that mattered. She had tried 5 times to install a ruler there. 5 times. The streets had rejected the choice before the ink dried on the transition papers. Not with protest, but with knives in the dark, with rulers found in palace corridors before their first sunrise in power. The country's loyalty to its royal bloodline ran deeper than any of Vanessa's operatives had accounted for, and after the fifth body, she made the only decision that preserved what remained of her operational security. She withdrew. She left the kingdom to rule itself, cut her losses, and told herself it didn't matter. 1 throne out of 5. She could live with that. England, she had never held at all. The king's personal guard, 500 men and women trained across generations for exactly this kind of threat, had turned every attempt she made into a body count of her own operatives. Assassins vanished. Spies were found. Her network in London had been gutted twice over, and still the crown sat exactly where it had always sat, untouched, unmoved, a monument to the one thing Vanessa hadn't planned for, an enemy who was better prepared than she was. It was the accumulation of these failures, not any single one, that cracked something loose in her. A woman who had spent a decade in silence, in shadow, in the discipline of never being seen, made, in a single furious night, the first true mistake of her criminal life. She went public, not with her name, not with a face the cameras could capture, but with a broadcast, routed through a dozen servers, impossible to trace back cleanly, but unmistakable in its content. She addressed the 5 nations' governments directly, her voice altered but her fury unmistakable in its cadence. She told them, in language that left no room for interpretation, that they served her. That every leader currently sitting in every capital was a puppet on a string she controlled. That the world had a queen now, whether it wanted one or not, and it would learn to kneel. It was the act of a woman who had built her entire empire on being invisible, and who had just, in one impulsive hour, made herself the single most wanted phantom on Earth. Her own people heard it too. Arthur Finch heard it in his palace in Beijing and felt something in him. The last thread of self-respect he'd been clinging to since she'd bought his freedom finally snapped. He had told himself, all this time, that he was a ruler. Her broadcast told him, in front of the intelligence services of 5 nations, that he was a leash with a title. Eleanor Vance heard it in Moscow, watching her currency burn, and felt the idealism that had once made her so easy to manipulate curdle into something far more dangerous: clarity. She understood, finally and completely, what she had done. She had been so certain she was helping build a better world. Instead, she had built a graveyard with her own signature on every headstone. In Washington, the 5-officer council heard it in their war room, and looked at each other with the particular silence of soldiers who have just realized they are not the ones holding the gun. And it was not only the leaders. It was Captain Miller, who had turned a blind eye to compromises he told himself were minor, only to realize the compromises had become the whole architecture of his life. It was Agent Shun, who had believed she was cutting through red tape and instead discovered she had helped build a machine with no brakes. It was Mark Jensen, the CIA operative who had told himself his sabotage was patriotism, listening to a broadcast that made it clear his patriotism had been rented, not earned. Every single one of them, the judge, the prosecutors, the agents, the soldiers, the pilot in his cockpit somewhere over an ocean that no longer felt like it belonged to any nation at all, heard the same message and understood, for the first time with total clarity, exactly what they had become. Not revolutionaries. Not architects of a new order. Servants. Property. Extensions of one woman's will. Disposable the moment they stopped being useful. Vanessa did not notice the shift right away, because she was too consumed by rage to look for it. She had lost a throne. She had lost a kingdom she'd never even held. And so instead of consolidating, instead of retreating into the shadows that had always kept her safe, she doubled down on cruelty, mistaking severity for strength the same way Arthur Finch had. She wrote laws, real laws, transmitted to her puppet governments with the expectation of immediate enactment, that had no purpose beyond declaring her own dominance. In China, under her direction, Finch decreed that any citizen who failed to publicly praise the new order once a week would be fined a month's wages. In Russia, Vance was made to announce that all private savings above a certain threshold would be seized as wartime contribution, a phrase that meant nothing except that Vanessa wanted the money and didn't care how it looked. In America, the military council imposed a rule that no citizen could gather in groups larger than 4 without a permit, a law so broad, so paranoid, that it turned every family dinner with extended relatives into a technical crime. And in her cruelest edict, transmitted to all 5 nations at once, she declared that a portion of every citizen's labor, weeks at a time, unpaid, unexplained, now belonged to her, framed as a unity tax that existed for no reason except that she had decided the world's labor was hers to spend as she wished. People who had jobs went to work and were not paid. People who had savings watched them seized. People who had families watched soldiers walk their streets at 5 o'clock, watched judges hand down sentences with no trial, watched leaders who had never faced an election answer to no one but a woman none of them had ever seen. Homes went unheated. Markets went empty. In 5 countries at once, the machinery of ordinary life, food, shelter, safety, the small, unremarkable dignity of being left alone to live, ground down to almost nothing, because the woman who had seized it all did not actually want to govern. She wanted to be worshipped, and worship does not put bread on a table. She had built her fortune, and now her throne, believing that fear was a foundation strong enough to build a legacy on. She had learned that lesson once already, 20 years ago, watching her father drink himself into a rage and call it love, and had somehow, in her decade-long climb to the top of the world, forgotten every bit of what that fear had actually cost. It had cost her mother a life. It had cost Vanessa a childhood. And now, an ocean away from either of those small, private griefs, it was about to cost her an empire. Because the people beneath her, not the citizens in the streets, who had no path to her at all, but the men and women she had personally recruited, personally broken, personally bent into loyalty, had begun, quietly, in rooms she did not control, to talk to each other. It started, as these things do, with 2 people who should never have trusted each other enough to speak freely, and did anyway, because desperation makes strange alliances. Eleanor Vance, watching her adopted country starve on money that was worthless the moment it left the printing press, reached out through a back channel to Arthur Finch, whose hands were stained with more blood than either of them had signed up for. They had never met in person. They had only ever existed to each other as names on Vanessa's roster, competing pieces on the same board. But Vance had a theory, and it was this. If Vanessa could destroy them individually with a phone call and a threat, then perhaps the only version of safety left to any of them was in numbers. "She's going to kill us the moment we stop being useful," Vance said, on a line she'd had swept for surveillance 3 times. "You know that." Finch was quiet for a long moment. "Then, I knew it the day I signed my first ruling for her. I just didn't want to say it out loud." From there, the network grew the way rot grows, invisible until it wasn't. Marcus Thorne, the district attorney with presidential ambitions, realized his promised governorship would never materialize because Vanessa had no intention of sharing legitimate power with anyone. The offer had only ever been a leash disguised as a reward. Julian Thorne, the defense lawyer, discovered, through documents he was never meant to see, that several of the clients he'd freed through legal acrobatics had since been quietly disposed of by Vanessa's own people once their usefulness expired, and understood, with the particular horror of a man realizing he has been an instrument of murder, that he might be next. Cassandra Hayes, the civil attorney who thought she'd been fighting corporate greed, watched Vanessa liquidate the very companies Hayes had crippled and route the proceeds into private accounts that had nothing to do with justice at all. Captain Miller and Agent Chun found each other over a conversation that started as routine coordination and ended, hours later, with both of them staring at a truth neither wanted to say first, that the woman they served didn't have a vision for the world. She had a wound, decades old, and she was making the entire planet bleed to try to close it. Even the military 5, the ones Vanessa had believed to be her most unbreakable instruments, began to fracture under the weight of what they'd built. Commander Sharma, the Navy SEAL, had told herself she was preparing for a new era of global peacekeeping. Instead, she'd watched 5 countries collapse into martial law, food shortages, and public executions, and understood that the peace she'd been promised was a fiction that existed only in Vanessa's private mythology. Colonel Vance, no relation to Eleanor, though the coincidence of names had always unsettled Vanessa slightly, had orchestrated psychological operations meant to destabilize enemies of a cause he now couldn't name with a straight face. Major Tanaka, the sniper, carried the particular guilt of a man who had killed believing he was purging corruption, only to realize the corruption had been sitting at the very top of his own chain of command the entire time. Captain Petrova, who had built Vanessa's elite personal guard with her own hands, began to understand that the guard she'd trained wasn't protecting a vision. It was protecting a single, increasingly unstable woman's ego. And Colonel Riley, flying reconnaissance over oceans and airspace that no longer felt like they belonged to anyone, found himself asking, for the first time in his career, who exactly he was fighting for, and coming up with an answer he didn't like. None of them moved yet. None of them dared. Vanessa's reach was still long enough, her intelligence network still sharp enough, that a single wrong word could end a career, a family, a life. But the seed had been planted in a decade of soil Vanessa herself had tilled, because she had built her entire team on the foundation of compromised people, people who had already crossed one line for her and could be made to cross another. She had never once considered that compromised people, given enough grievance and enough time, are also the people most capable of turning on the hand that compromised them. She had taught every one of them how to betray a trust. She had simply never imagined they would eventually use that lesson on her. Vanessa, meanwhile, sat at the center of her command floor, increasingly alone with the numbers rather than the people. She had never learned, because no one had ever taught her, because the last person to try had died with painkillers in her bloodstream at the bottom of a bathtub. That power sustained by fear alone is a currency that devalues the moment the fear stops being effective. She screamed at her operatives over encrypted lines when reports disappointed her. She threatened Finch's family, still living quietly in a province he'd hoped she didn't know about, when his executions failed to produce obedience. She cut Vance's resources in half as punishment for the ruble's collapse, which only accelerated the collapse further. She belittled Thorne's political ambitions to his face, reminding him, in front of his own aides, that his governorship existed only as long as she allowed it to. She disregarded every warning her most capable people tried to give her, that the American Council's curfews were breeding resistance cells faster than they could contain them, that the Chinese executions were creating martyrs instead of obedience, that the Russian economy was a match burning toward a fuse she hadn't noticed yet, because in her mind, disagreement was disloyalty, and disloyalty had only ever had one acceptable outcome since the night she'd left Lawrence Hubbard bleeding out in his own bed. She had built the largest, most secretive criminal network the modern world had ever seen, and she ran it exactly the way her father had run his own house 20 years earlier, with violence standing in for leadership and cruelty standing in for love. She simply hadn't lived long enough, hadn't grieved long enough, hadn't healed long enough to understand that she had become the very thing she'd spent her whole life avenging. By the second month, 5 nations were in various stages of collapse. Homeless encampments swelled in cities that had once been engines of the global economy. Currencies failed. Curfews bred underground networks of resistance that met in basements and forests in the backs of shuttered churches, planning uprisings against leaders who, unbeknownst to the ordinary people risking their lives to overthrow them, were themselves prisoners of a single unseen woman's will. The world's intelligence agencies, the legitimate ones, the ones Vanessa hadn't managed to compromise, began, independently and without coordination, to notice a pattern too strange to be coincidence. 5 governments, 5 simultaneous transitions, 5 sets of policy decisions that made no rational sense unless viewed as instruments of the exact same hidden hand. And within Vanessa's own command structure, the whispers that had started as private confessions between 2 desperate people had become, by the second month, something far more dangerous, a plan. Nothing had been decided yet, not the how, not the when, not which of them would be the one to finally move against a woman who had built her legend on always being one step ahead of everyone in her life. But the plan existed now, unspoken in most rooms, understood in all of them. 11 of her most powerful instruments, a judge, a prosecutor, a district attorney, 2 lawyers, a police captain, an FBI agent, a CIA operative, a Coast Guard commander, a border agent, an ATF specialist, and 5 military officers who had once sworn themselves to her singular vision, had begun to see each other not as rivals for Vanessa's favor, but as the only people on Earth who understood exactly what she was and exactly what she had made them become. Vanessa Hitch, Queen of 5 Nations, richest woman the world had ever produced, sat in her blacked-out command center on the last night of that second month and allowed herself, for one unguarded moment, to feel something like triumph. The reports on her screens were bad. Currencies crashing, curfews failing, whispers of coordinated resistance in 3 capitals at once. But she told herself, the way she had always told herself, that chaos was simply the price of remaking a world. She poured herself a drink she didn't need, looked out over a skyline she didn't own but had effectively conquered, and allowed herself to believe, one final time, that she was untouchable. She did not know that in a secure room in Moscow, Eleanor Vance and Arthur Finch, speaking, for the first time, on a line neither of them had told anyone else about, had just agreed on a single word between them, soon. She did not know that Captain Miller and Agent Chun had begun compiling a file, evidence collected in careful, deniable increments over weeks, documenting every crime Vanessa had ever ordered them to commit. A file meant not for a courtroom, because there was no court left in 5 Nations that wasn't already hers, but for something far more permanent. She did not know that Colonel Vance and Major Tanaka had begun a quiet conversation about the particular skill set required to remove a target who believed, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never once been made to answer for anything, that she could not be reached. She did not know, sitting there with her drink and her skyline and her decade of careful, patient, murderous ambition finally paying off, that the same instinct that had once made her study her own father for 7 years, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, the exact moment he would be most vulnerable, was now being turned on her by 11 people she had personally taught how to wait, how to plan, and how to strike without ever being seen coming. She had built her empire on the belief that cruelty was strength and fear was loyalty. She was about to learn, the way her father had learned it before her, in a bedroom he thought was his sanctuary, that the people closest to a tyrant are always the ones who know exactly where the throat is. The seeds of her destruction, sown a decade earlier in loyalty tests she had designed to bind her people to her forever, had finally, quietly, begun to sprout. What comes up must come down. And somewhere in the dark of that second month, 11 people who had once called themselves her instruments began, instead, to call themselves something else. Her judges. End of part 4. About the author Michael Anthony Neal Jr. Michael Anthony Neal Jr. is a multifaceted artist and entrepreneur, a true force in the creative world. Hailing from Marina, California, and now residing in the vibrant city of Seattle, Washington, Michael is an established author who fearlessly explores all genres, captivating readers with his diverse storytelling. Beyond the written word, he is a talented musician, artist, and songwriter, crafting compelling music that resonates with audiences. Michael's entrepreneurial spirit shines through his ownership of Thrilla Productions, a dynamic production and publishing company, and Hoodies by Design, a unique clothing and accessory business. It is the profound love for what he does that fuels his relentless drive, allowing him to seamlessly juggle the demands of writing and publishing books, creating and publishing music, and running his thriving businesses. For Michael, this isn't just work, it's his passion, his dream life realized.